I'm Daniel Pacto, the global co-leader of McKinsey Sustainability. So climate technology and climate technology innovation is on a massive upswing here in North America and frankly globally. I think we as a firm have talked quite a bit and written about the net zero equation and what it will take for industry sectors, for companies, and frankly also for society to get to net zero. And I think we've had a strong point of view calling out the elephant in the room that this equation doesn't close today, and that one of the biggest delta is going to be the ability for us to build some of this new climate technology. We talk about significant investments. We think of, it's in the area, in the zone of $3 trillion per year over the next 30 years, which is going to be required. It's incremental capital required to actually build the energy infrastructure. And a big part of this is going to have to go into new climate technologies. And we do feel that we're a bit in a similar world than we were 25 years ago at the beginning of digital, which is there's a massive influx of capital, of also startup innovation, of also incumbents building new technologies, and ranging from all colors of hydrogen to long duration energy storage, to next generation materials, to alternate proteins, etc. These are really areas where we're seeing now, especially the private equity firms that actually have built green funds are actually investing in these areas significantly. And we also see incumbents who are raising capital or deploying capital on building new electrolyzer business, new hydrogen businesses, etc. And the other question here is what's happening at the collaboration or at the intersection of the private sector and the public sector. And I think there as well, I think we've seen nations and countries, and the US is a good example, where infrastructure and green energy infrastructure is actually a big priority. And I think what we're seeing is we're seeing more collaboration between the private sector and the public sector to actually scale these new climate technologies. The interest in climate technology and climate technology innovation is actually going up significantly, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And I think we will see more public-private partnerships and collaborations to scale the new and clean energy infrastructure. We talked about the amount of capital reallocation that's going to happen. I mean, we're talking $2 to $3 trillion per year over 30 years to build the new energy infrastructure. And I think that's going to happen, in the private sector and in the public sector as well. And when we see countries releasing significant infrastructure bills, for example, a big part of that focus is to actually create the demand and frankly also the supply for some of these new energy capabilities, from solar to wind, but then also frankly hydrogen. We believe that there's still an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to create a vibrant and viable hydrogen economy, to frankly move, to create a bit the connection between where we actually produce green energy and then where we need to consume energy. And there's a big question on transportation. And I think some of these, very innovative models are being funded today in the private sector, but also with active participation of the public sector. So I think, this is an area where we actually will see a lot more public-private partnerships to actually accelerate the pace of technology, of climate technology innovation. Some example of really innovative climate technology innovations. I think what has happened in Europe around green steel, I think has been really impressive. And I think we've actually seen, if you want, green steel production scaling rapidly. And then I think what's also been surprising is the order books for some of these new green material companies are already filled up for the next 3 or 4 years. I think what's been also interesting in the US is I think incumbents have decided that, or have realized that they need to do two things at the same time. They need to decarbonize the core and at the same time build the new. And there's several examples in the automotive and assembly space where incumbents are actually building new, if you want, power businesses, right? Green power businesses, alternate power businesses. And this could be electrolyzer based, this could be, electric vehicle based, etc. And I think we're seeing this trend happening really aggressively. So the other area where we've seen significant, if you want, innovation is in the alternate protein world. So I think we've seen this with, non-dairy milk, right? So oat milk or almond milk and all sorts of different non-dairy like products. We've also seen this with, alternate proteins around non-meat based proteins and different flavors and different versions of plant-based proteins that taste like beef. And I think we've seen this expand quite a bit. And then I think there's another area which is just the next gen materials that are being built. So for example, green batteries and what it would take to do that, and what are some of the alternate ways of building this. And I actually think this idea of building zero carbon product is actually a pretty important priority for a lot of the industrial incumbents as well, which is how can we actually start building zero carbon product. And I think it has started in Europe, but I think it's also front and center now in the US as well. The financial sector is really playing a critical role in this transition to net zero. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the US is that the pace of the transition in some instances is driven less by the regulatory environment and actually a lot more by investors and the capital markets. And I think, we believe, and I think we've seen this now, that I think a lot of the banking institutions, the asset managers, the private equity firms, I think are deploying significant amount of capital in some of these new climate technology innovations, and are also setting high expectations for incumbents to increase their presence in some of these new climate technologies. And it was interesting to look at several oil and gas companies are saying that, hey, we're moving from being in oil and gas to being in carbon management. We're building new hydrogen capabilities. We're building new carbon capture capabilities. We're actually going to build next-gen innovations around different battery and storage technologies, et cetera. That for me is a perfect example of the level of innovation that is happening now in the US. And I think what's interesting is this is getting measured now. And so the say-do ratio between commitments made and actions taken, the bar on that say-do ratio is actually rising rapidly. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of leadership teams now realizing that we're almost past the commitment phase. We're really on how rapidly can we scale some of these new capabilities and climate technologies. And then frankly, how do we tap into the capital markets to be able to fund it? And I think we're seeing this happening, at rapid pace here in the US, but also in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia.
I'd like to make 3 points to you about climate technologies today. One is about the magnitude of the funding. The second is about where it will go, main technologies, and third, progress, where I'll use India as an illustration. First, on the magnitude of climate technology funding, our own assessment as McKinsey is that about $9.2 trillion of spend will be needed in land, mobility, energy systems between now and 2050. For the Earth to be on the 1.5 degree pathway, or the pathway to 2050 net zero. About half of this 9.2 trillion is either new spending or spending that will get reallocated from gray assets to greener assets, so newer climate technologies. On my second point of what the main climate technologies are going to be, our own assessment is that there are about 10 of them that are going to be the most important. I'll give you a few illustrations of the obvious ones. There's, of course, renewables to modify or change the power systems. There's mobility, electric vehicles particularly. There is storage, which is going to be critically important to support many of these sectors. And there's hydrogen for industrial decarbonization. There's CCUS, carbon capture, use, as well as storage. There's technologies that will come to play in agri and food chains. There's recycling, which is going to be critically important, and as important to support role from carbon markets. Some of these technologies will, in effect, be responsible for a very large proportion of the decarbonization of the world. Now, if we think about the progress on these technologies, and I'll use a few illustrations to describe this from India. Renewables, for example, which started with blending mandates and reverse auctions, has now become very mature. There is some amount of grid support that's provided into renewables in India, one of the largest renewables markets in the world, but it's quite mature, quite well adopted. The government knows how to create the markets for more and more of renewables to come to play. On the other hand, if you take something like electric vehicles, two-wheelers, four-wheelers, the schemes haven't quite worked. However, the expectation is that two-wheelers will become economic relative to the petrol alternative. And so therefore, we do see very significant investment going on into two-wheeler electric vehicles. And then if you take another technology which is a bit further out, hydrogen, which will be leverageable in industrial decarbonization as well as potentially in mobility and stabilization of the power grids, there the progress is early. Several companies have made announcements, Adani, Reliance, for example, of making big investments in combination with renewables in hydrogen. Just last week, the government of India has come out with its policy, which will again allow for grid banking of renewable power and therefore reduce the cost of hydrogen by increasing the utilization of electrolyzers. Demand still has to get stimulated for this. So relatively early stage of development of these technologies. This just acts as an illustration to say that there are some technologies which are maturing very quickly. There are others which are on the come. And we are moving all through these in the right direction.